Ayla clutched the thin fabric of her festival gown, the coarse weave scratching against her skin. Around her, the moon festival pulsed with a life she could only ever watch from the periphery. Laughter and the scent of roasted meats mingled with the earthy musk of wolves, a scent that was a constant, painful reminder of what she lacked. She was an Omega, a blight on the proud lineage of the Blackwood pack, the girl whose wolf had never answered the call of the moon. A dud, a broken thing. Her father's gaze was a physical weight across the crowded clearing. He stood with the other pack elders, his shoulders squared with a rigid pride that never seemed to include her. Beside him, her sister Lena shimmered. Lena, whose magnificent silver wolf was the pride of their family, was accepting congratulations on her recent promotion within the pack's hunting echelon. She was everything Ayla was not. Strong, confident, whole. Ayla lowered her eyes to the trampled grass, focusing on the small, resilient wildflowers that pushed their way through the dirt. She felt a kinship with them. She had learned resilience, if nothing else. The whispers that followed her were like a cloak she could never shrug off. Wolfless, they hissed. Barren. The words were meant to cut, and they did. But years of such treatment had honed the wounds into smooth, hard scars. She possessed a strange sort of quietness, an ability that the pack's shamans had dismissed as a useless sensitivity. Agitated hounds would calm at her approach, their growls softening into whimpers. Frightened fawns in the forest would allow her to come close. She could soothe frayed nerves with a touch, a hummed tune, a steady presence. In a society that valued the strength of the beast, the power of tooth and claw, her gentle gift was seen as a sign of her inherent weakness. "Still sulking in the shadows, little sister?" Lena's voice was warm, but it held the same undercurrent of pity Ayla had come to despise. Ayla forced a smile, looking up at her radiant sibling. "Just enjoying the night air." "Congratulations, Lena. I heard you led the Northern Patrol." "It was nothing," Lena said with a dismissive wave, though her eyes shone with pride. "Father is pleased. He wishes you would try harder, try harder," as if it were a matter of will, as if she hadn't spent countless nights under the full moon, screaming into the silent forest, begging for the shift that never came. The pain of that failure was a hollow ache in her bones. "I am trying," she murmured, the lie tasting like ash on her tongue. A sudden hush fell over the festival grounds. It was not a silence of peace, but one of thick, heavy anticipation. A wave of power, cold and immense, rolled through the clearing, prickling Ayla's skin and making the hairs on her arms stand on end. Every wolf, from the strongest alpha to the lowest omega, bowed their head in submission. Every instinct she didn't know she possessed screamed at her to do the same. The Alpha King had arrived. She risked a glance from beneath her lashes. He was a figure of terrifying legend, a recluse who ruled the territories with an iron fist. Whispers said he was cursed, that his wolf was a monstrous thing that drove him to bouts of uncontrollable rage. They said he was cruel, scarred, and broken. They said he hadn't been seen at a pack festival in years. He moved through the parted crowd like a predator, his presence a vortex of raw dominance. His beta, a grim-faced wolf named Fen, walked a step behind him, his eyes scanning the crowd for threats. But all eyes were on the king. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, broad-shouldered and clad in black leather that seemed to absorb the moonlight. His face was a mask of cold indifference, but she saw it, a flicker of something raw and agonizing in the depths of his dark eyes. A pain he held leashed with brutal control. Her strange, useless empathy resonated with it, a low thrum of shared suffering that made her heart ache. He was a king, and she was nothing, yet she recognized the look of a soul in a cage. Lord Malachi, the king's uncle and a high-ranking elder in their own pack, stepped forward, his expression a practiced mix of deference and ambition. "Your Majesty, we are honored by your presence." The king did not respond. His gaze swept over the assembled wolves, dismissive and cold. It was a look that stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw hierarchy of power. He was the apex, and they were all, every one of them, beneath him. And Ayla, lowest of the low, felt his power like a physical blow, rooting her to the spot. The air remained thick with a tension that choked the festive atmosphere. The musicians had fallen silent, the dancers had frozen mid-step. The arrival of King Ronan had cast a pall over the celebration, transforming it into a tense display of fealty. He walked the perimeter of the clearing, a silent, brooding monarch inspecting his territory. No one met his eyes. No one dared to speak. Ayla tried to make herself smaller, to blend into the shadows at the edge of the crowd. She wished she could simply disappear. His power was a suffocating pressure, a constant reminder of her own deficiency. It was the roar of a hurricane to her whisper of a breeze. Lord Malachi followed the king, his voice a low, sycophantic murmur that grated on Ayla's nerves. He was pointing out the pack's prize hunters, the successful litters of the past year, all the markers of strength and prosperity. He was selling his pack's worth, and by extension his own. When his gaze swept past Ayla, it was filled with a familiar, cold contempt, as if her very existence was an embarrassment he had to endure. Suddenly, a commotion erupted nearby. Two young alphas, their chests puffed out with drink and bravado, began to shove one another. It was a stupid, pointless dominance display, the kind that happened at every festival. "He insulted my mate," one snarled, his control slipping. "Your mate has the eyes of a stray dog," the other retorted. Normally, the pack enforcers would have intervened instantly, but they were frozen, their attention fixed on the king. The fight escalated with shocking speed. A fist flew and one of the alphas staggered backward, crashing into a table laden with food. The table overturned with a tremendous crash of pottery and spilled wine. People scrambled to get out of the way, creating a wave of motion that rippled through the crowd. Ayla was caught in the surge. Someone shoved her from behind, hard. Her foot caught on an exposed tree root, and her balance vanished. Time seemed to slow down, the gasps of the crowd elongating into a drawn-out sigh. She flailed, her arms windmilling uselessly, her trajectory carrying her out of the shadows and into the open space that had been cleared for the king. She was falling directly into his path. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. To touch the Alpha King was unthinkable. It was a violation of the highest order. The punishment would be severe, perhaps even death. She saw her father's face, contorted in a mask of horror and fury. She saw Lena's wide, disbelieving eyes. She braced for the impact of the hard-packed earth, for the humiliation, for the pain that was sure to follow. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent apology dying on her lips. But she did not hit the ground. Instead, her fall was broken by something solid and unyielding. Strong hands clamped around her arms, steadying her with an effortless strength that stole her breath. The scent of pine and winter frost and something else, something wild and elemental and deeply masculine, enveloped her. It was intoxicating and terrifying. She opened her eyes and found herself looking up into the face of King Ronan. He held her. His fingers were a brand against her skin, sending a jolt of pure energy through her veins. It was not a wolf's spark, not the familiar thrum of pack magic. It was something else entirely. ancient and powerful. For a breathless moment, the world ceased to exist. There was only the startling intensity of his gaze, the dark eyes that seemed to see past her wolfless shame, past her omega status, and into the very core of her being. A stunned, absolute silence fell over the entire festival. The fight was forgotten. The whispers died. The very air seemed to hold its breath. And Omega, a wolfless girl, had fallen into the arms of the cursed king. And he had not pushed her away. He was still holding her, his expression unreadable, a storm of emotions warring behind his glacial composure. In that frozen moment, Isla's world tilted on its axis. The king's hands were still on her arms, not crushing, but firm, anchoring her in a reality that felt surreal. The energy that had jolted through her was now a steady, humming current. It didn't feel threatening. It felt like recognition. A deep, resonant chord struck somewhere inside her, a place she hadn't known existed. The quiet part of her, the part that soothed beasts and calmed storms, reached out toward the roaring tempest she sensed within him. His eyes, dark as a moonless night, held hers. She saw the flicker of pain again, but this time it was different. It was overlaid with a profound, bone-deep shock. His nostrils flared slightly, and she knew he was taking in her scent. She braced for the disgust, the dismissal she always received from powerful alphas who could scent her lack of a wolf. But his expression didn't change to contempt. It tightened, a knot of confusion and something akin to disbelief forming between his brows. His grip on her arms became almost unconsciously protective. For Ronan, the world had been a symphony of pain for over a decade. It was a constant, grinding agony that lived in his bones, a fire that licked at the edges of his sanity. The curse was a relentless beast, and he spent every waking moment fighting to keep it caged. His wolf, a creature of immense power, was twisted by the same affliction, making every full moon a descent into a private hell. When the girl stumbled into him, his first instinct was a flash of violent rage, an interruption, a violation. He was a breath away from flinging her aside, from letting his power lash out and make an example of her carelessness. But then she was in his arms, and her scent hit him. It wasn't the fiery, challenging scent of an alpha female, or the submissive sweetness of a typical omega. It was something else. It smelled of quiet forests after a rain, of chamomile and clean earth, and something unnamably serene. And as the scent filled his senses, the impossible happened. The pain receded. It didn't vanish, but the razor-sharp edges softened. The roaring fire in his blood quieted to a manageable ember. For the first time in years, a moment of genuine peace settled over him. It was so foreign, so utterly unexpected, that it stunned him into inaction. He stared down at the girl, this slip of a thing with wide, frightened eyes, and a single desperate thought consumed him. What are you? The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing. Lord Malachi took a hesitant step forward, his face a mask of outrage. Your Majesty, forgive this Omega's clumsiness. She will be punished immediately. Ronan's head snapped up, his gaze fixing on his uncle with a cold fire that made the older wolf flinch. Silence! The word was a low growl, a command that vibrated through the very ground. He finally released Ayla, but he did not step away. He took her by the elbow, his touch surprisingly gentle. You, he said, his voice a gravelly rumble meant for her alone. You will come with me. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and began walking toward the large hall at the edge of the clearing, pulling her along with him. The crowd parted before them like the sea, 1,000 pairs of eyes following their progress with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Isla stumbled to keep up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel her father's burning stare on her back, a silent condemnation that was worse than any shout. Fen, the king's beta, moved to block the entrance after they passed through, his body a solid wall against the prying eyes of the pack. The heavy wooden doors boomed shut, plunging them into the relative quiet of the hall. The space was lit by a large hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. The king finally stopped and turned to face her. The power rolling off him was immense, almost suffocating in the enclosed space. "What is your name?" "Ayla," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ayla," he repeated, tasting the name. He studied her, his gaze intense and analytical, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Why did the pain stop when I touched you?" The question was so direct, so raw that it caught her completely off guard. He wasn't accusing her of witchcraft or deceit. He was asking with a desperate sincerity that belied his fearsome reputation. He was asking her for an answer she didn't have. I don't know what you mean, my lord," she stammered. A flash of frustration crossed his face. "Do not lie to me. When you fell against me, the curse, it quieted." "How?" She could only shake her head, her mind reeling. His curse? The whispers were true, and somehow her touch had affected it. The useless, gentle part of her had touched the most powerful, tormented wolf in the world and brought him a moment of peace. The irony was staggering. It was terrifying. And for the first time in her life, Ayla felt a flicker not of weakness, but of a strange, inexplicable power. The king's fortress was a monument to isolation. Carved from the gray stone of the mountain itself, it was a place of sharp angles, cold corridors, and echoing silence. It was less a home than a cage, and as Ayla was led through its massive gates by the stoic beta, Fen, she felt the lock turn on her old life. Her family had not protested her departure. Her father's face had been a mask of grim acceptance, as if he were finally ridding himself of a long-held burden. Lena had looked worried, but she had remained silent. No one defied the king. Ayla was given a small Spartan room in the royal wing. It was clean but bare, with a narrow bed, a small wardrobe, and a single window overlooking a sheer drop down the mountainside. There was no escape. She was a prisoner, though her crime was a mystery. "The king has commanded that you remain here," Fen informed her, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will be provided for. Do not attempt to leave this wing." He turned to go, his duty done. "Wait," Ayla called out, her voice small in the cavernous hallway. "Why am I here? What does he want from me?" Fen paused and looked back at her, a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, in his eyes. "The king has his reasons. It is not my place to question them, and I would advise you not to either." With that, he was gone, his footsteps receding into the oppressive silence. The first few days were a study in loneliness. A servant brought her meals on a tray, leaving it outside her door without a word. She saw no one else. She spent her time staring out the window at the endless expanse of forest and sky, feeling as remote and insignificant as a speck of dust. The fear was a constant companion, but beneath it, a strange curiosity grew. She kept replaying the moment at the festival, the jolt of connection, the look of stunned disbelief in the king's eyes. He was tormented by a curse, and somehow she had offered him a moment's reprieve. On the fourth day, the king summoned her. She was led by a guard to a vast library, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with ancient books. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in, and King Ronan sat in a high-backed chair before it, a heavy tome open in his lap. He did not look up as she entered. "You can read?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in her bones. "Yes, my lord." Her mother had taught her, a secret indulgence in a pack that valued literacy far less than fighting prowess. "Good." He gestured to a stool near the fire. "Sit. Read to me." My eyes tire of the script. It was a command, not a request. Ayla's hands trembled as she took the book he indicated, a collection of old legends and histories. She found the marked page and began to read, her voice shaky at first, then growing steadier as she lost herself in the rhythm of the words. She read for hours, the only sounds in the room the crackling of the fire and the soft turning of pages. She did not know how much time had passed when he finally spoke again. "Enough." She stopped, her throat dry. She risked a glance at him. His eyes were closed, his head leaning back against the chair. The harsh lines of his face seemed to have softened. The ever-present tension in his shoulders had eased. He looked peaceful. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was her presence, her voice, that was doing this, just as her touch had done at the festival. This became their routine. Every day she would be summoned to the library to read. Sometimes they sat in silence for hours. He never spoke of the curse again, and she never dared to ask. But she could feel it, a low hum of pain that always surrounded him, and she could feel it lessen when she was near. He was using her as a balm, a living poultice for his private agony. She began to see the man behind the fearsome monarch. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the deep-seated loneliness that mirrored her own. He was as much an outcast as she was, isolated not by weakness, but by a power so great it had become a prison. A strange, fragile bond began to form between them in the quiet sanctity of the library, woven from shared silence and ancient stories. He started to look at her not as a curiosity or a tool, but as a person. One afternoon, he found her staring out a window, a melancholic expression on her face. "You miss the forest," he stated, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The next day, he led her to a walled garden high up in the fortress, a hidden sanctuary of green that she hadn't known existed. "You may come here when you wish," he said gruffly, before leaving her alone amongst the flowers. It was the kindest gesture anyone had shown her in years. The tentative peace of their routine was shattered by the arrival of Lord Malachi. Ayla was in the garden, tending to a patch of wilting moon-petal flowers, when she sensed his presence. It was a cold, slithering thing, a stark contrast to the king's overwhelming but clean power. She stood up, brushing dirt from her simple dress, and turned to find him standing at the archway, his lips curled into a sneer. "So, the king keeps his little pet in a gilded cage," Malachi said, his voice dripping with condescension. He stepped into the garden, his eyes roaming over her with disdain. "I must admit, I don't see the appeal. A wolfless omega, a disgrace. What sort of spell have you cast on him?" Ayla's chin lifted. The fear she'd once felt for this man was being replaced by a slow-burning anger. "I have cast no spell, my lord. The king commands, and I obey. That is all." "Is it?" He took another step closer, invading her space. "He neglects his duties. He refuses to see the council. He spends his days cloistered with you. The packs are whispering. They say he is growing weak, soft. They say his curse is finally consuming him, and you are the symptom of his decay." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, intended to wound and intimidate. "His Majesty's health is not for me to speak of," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. Malachi laughed, a short, ugly sound. You are more clever than you look. But do not mistake his momentary fascination for anything more. You are a distraction, a tool. And when he tires of you, or when you are no longer useful, you will be discarded. And I will be there to ensure it is a permanent arrangement. The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the air between them like a poison. He reached out as if to touch her face, and she flinched back instinctively. Do not touch her. The voice was like the crack of a glacier. King Ronan stood at the garden entrance, his entire form radiating a lethal stillness. He had moved with no sound, a phantom of fury. His eyes were not on Ayla, but were locked on his uncle, and they burned with an intensity that promised violence. Malachi immediately straightened, his sneer replaced by a mask of polite concern. Your Majesty, I was merely having a word with the Omega, expressing my concern for your well-being. Your concern is noted, Ronan said, his voice dangerously soft. He walked slowly toward them, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped beside Ayla, placing himself between her and his uncle, a silent, possessive gesture that spoke volumes. This garden, and every room in this wing, is part of my private domain. You are not welcome here. You will address me through my beta from now on. Is that understood? The insult was profound. To be denied direct access to the king was a major political blow. Malachi's face paled, his eyes flickering with hatred. As you command, my king. He gave a stiff, formal bow and retreated, his dignity in tatters. The silence he left behind was heavy. Ronan did not move. Ayla could feel the rage pouring off him in waves. His curse, she realized, was agitated by strong emotion. The pain must be flaring. Without thinking, she reached out and gently touched his arm. My lord, she whispered. His entire body went rigid at her touch. He looked down at her hand on his leather-clad forearm as if it were a foreign object. She expected him to pull away, to snarl at her for her presumption. Instead, he took a deep, shuddering breath. The tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. The murderous inferno in his eyes banked slightly. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw not just pain or curiosity in his gaze, but a raw, aching vulnerability. He is right about one thing, Ronan said, his voice a rough rasp. You are a distraction. He turned and strode from the garden, leaving her alone with the scent of flowers and the distinct, terrifying feeling that she had become essential to the most dangerous man in the kingdom. And that made her the most vulnerable person of all. The days that followed Malachi's visit were fraught with a new kind of tension. The fragile peace of their library routine was gone, replaced by a charged awareness. Ronan was more volatile, his mood swinging from brooding silence to sharp, irritable commands. Ayla understood that his uncle's visit had not only been a threat to her, but a political move against him, using her as the weapon. The whispers Malachi had spoken of had found their way into the fortress, and the weight of the crown seemed heavier on Ronan's shoulders. The pain of his curse was visibly worsening. He would often stop mid-sentence, his hand clenching into a fist, a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. In those moments, Ayla would instinctively move closer, perhaps to straighten a stack of books, or add a log to the fire. Her proximity always seemed to grant him a measure of relief, a loosening of the vise that held him. He never acknowledged it, but he began to keep her near him for longer periods, finding pretexts for her to remain in the library or his study late into the evening. She was no longer just his reader, she was his anchor, and they both knew it. As the moon began to wax, growing fuller each night, A dreadful sense of anticipation settled over the castle. The guards became more vigilant, their faces grim. Fen was a constant, hovering presence, his eyes filled with a weary anxiety. Ronan grew more and more restless, pacing the length of the library like a caged animal. The pain was escalating, building toward a crescendo that Ayla could only guess at. One evening, 2 days before the full moon, he dismissed her abruptly. "Go," he snarled, his back to her as he stared into the fire. "Leave me." The raw agony in his voice cut through the anger. She hesitated, her heart aching for him. "My lord, if I can help." "You cannot!" he roared, whirling to face her. His eyes were wild, the pupils dilated with pain. "Your presence. It is a temporary reprieve, a candle in a hurricane. The storm is coming, and you will not be here to witness it. Now go." Frightened by the ferocity of his outburst, she fled. Later that night, Fen found her in the garden. The moon was a swollen sliver of silver, casting an ethereal glow on the stone walls. "He did not mean to frighten you," the beta said, his voice low. "He is trying to protect you." "From what?" Ayla whispered, hugging her arms against the chill. "The curse. What does it do to him?" Fen's gaze was heavy with years of secrets and sorrow. "It is a torment of the flesh and the spirit. An old affliction in his bloodline, passed from king to king. On the night of the full moon, the pain becomes unbearable. It breaks him. It unleashes a beast that is not truly his wolf, but a creature of pure agony and rage. It has no reason, no restraint. It would not know you." The implication was horrifying. He would kill me. It wasn't a question. He would kill anything that crossed its path. Fen corrected grimly. "For his entire reign, I have been the only one to witness it. I lock him in the undercroft, in a chamber reinforced with silver and stone, and I wait for the dawn. I listen to him scream." The beta's composure finally cracked, a flicker of profound pain crossing his face. "He is a good king, Ayla. A good man, trapped in a private hell. He pushes you away because he is terrified of what he might do to you. On the night of the full moon, you must not leave your room, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Ayla nodded, a cold dread seeping into her bones. She understood his warning perfectly, but as she looked up at the ripening moon, she also understood something else. She could not, would not hide in her room while the man who had shown her the first real kindness in her life was being torn apart by his own soul. Fen's warning was a command to save herself, but every instinct she possessed, every fiber of her being, was screaming at her to save him. The night of the full moon descended upon the fortress like a shroud. An unnatural silence reigned, heavier and more profound than the usual quiet. The guards were gone from the hallways, and the fires in the hearths were banked low, as if the very castle were holding its breath. From her room, Ayla could see the moon, a perfect, luminous circle of white fire in the black sky. It seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, pouring its power down onto the world below. She heard it begin just after midnight. It was not a wolf's howl, but a scream of pure, unadulterated agony. It was a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, a sound of breaking bones and a soul being ripped asunder. It echoed up through the stone floors, a horrifying testament to the suffering Fen had described. Ayla's hands flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. This was his hell. This was the storm he had wanted to shield her from. Fen's warning rang in her ears. "No matter what you hear." But the screams were a physical force, pulling at her, demanding she act. The gentle, empathetic core of her being recoiled from such immense suffering. To do nothing felt like a betrayal. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and resolve. She could stay here, safe in her room, and let him endure this alone. Or she could go to him. She could face the beast he became, armed with nothing but the strange, unexplainable connection that existed between them. It was madness. It was suicide. She chose madness. Slipping out of her room, Isla moved through the darkened, empty corridors. The screams were her guide, growing louder and more terrifying as she descended into the lower levels of the fortress. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of old stone, dampness, and a rising metallic tang of blood and raw magic. She found the chamber Fen had spoken of in the Undercroft. It was set apart from the dungeons, a heavy iron-banded door secured with a massive silver lock. A small barred window was set into the door at eye level. The sounds from within were monstrous, the splintering of wood, the shriek of metal, and the guttural, inhuman roars of a creature in torment. Her hands shaking, Isla pulled herself up to peer through the bars. What she saw would be seared into her memory for the rest of her life. The room was bare stone, its walls scarred with deep gouges. In the center, bathed in a single shaft of moonlight from a high grate, was a nightmare. It was not Ronan. It was not his wolf. It was a writhing mass of shadow and rage, a vaguely canine form that seemed to be constantly, painfully shifting. Bones snapped and reformed, limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles. Shadowy tendrils whipped out from its body, smashing against the walls. Its eyes were pits of burning red light, devoid of all reason or recognition. This was his curse, a living, breathing agony given monstrous form. It, thrashed on the floor, its roars turning into whimpers of pain that were somehow more terrible than the rage. She saw the man within the monster, a prisoner inside his own skin, fighting a battle he could never win. Her heart broke. All fear vanished, replaced by an overwhelming wave of compassion. She didn't realize she had made a sound, a small gasp of pity, until the creature's head snapped up. The burning red eyes locked onto her through the barred window. A new sound ripped from its throat, a focused, hungry snarl. It had a target now. It had her. It lunged at the door. The impact was like a thunderclap. The heavy iron door shuddered in its stone frame, the silver lock groaning in protest. Isla stumbled back, her heart leaping into her throat. The creature slammed against the door again. And again. A being of singular, destructive purpose. It wanted her. She could feel its rage, a tidal wave of pure, undiluted fury. But underneath it, she could also feel its pain, a deep, abyssal agony that was the source of its power. Her strange empathy didn't shrink from it. It reached for it. "Ronan," she whispered, her voice trembling. She pressed her hand against the cold iron of the door, as if she could reach him through it. "Ronan, it's me." "It's Ayla." A deafening shriek of tortured metal answered her. A crack appeared in the thick oak. The silver lock, supernaturally strong, was beginning to bend under the relentless, cursed assault. Fen had said the chamber was secure, but he had never accounted for this. He had never accounted for a focus, a target for the creature's rage. With a final explosive crash, the lock shattered. The door flew from its hinges and smashed against the opposite wall. The beast stood framed in the doorway, a hulking silhouette of shadow and moonlight. It was larger than any wolf, its form still shifting and unstable, its red eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. It lowered its head, a low, rumbling growl building in its chest as it fixed its gaze on her. This was it. This was the death he had tried to save her from. But as it took a step forward, Ayla stood her ground. She did not scream. She did not run. She simply looked at it, and she let all the compassion she felt for the man trapped inside shine from her eyes. She focused on her scent, on the calming presence that soothed frightened animals, and pushed it outward with all her will. "I'm not afraid of you, Ronan," she said, her voice soft but clear in the echoing chamber. "I know you're in there. I know you're hurting. Let me help you." The creature paused, its head cocked as if confused. It took another step, then another, stalking toward her. The scent of her, the sound of her voice, was a strange foreign element in its world of pure agony. It was a note of peace in a symphony of pain. It lunged. It happened in a blur of shadow and teeth. Isla squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But the killing blow never came. Instead, a massive weight crashed into her, knocking her to the ground. She felt hot breath on her face, heard a guttural whine next to her ear. She opened her eyes. The monstrous head was inches from hers, the red glow in its eyes flickering. It wasn't attacking. It had collapsed. The massive, shadowy form lay sprawled at her feet, shuddering violently. The shadows began to recede, dissolving like smoke. The bones snapped and cracked, not in growth, but in retreat, shrinking back into a human form. In seconds, the monster was gone. Lying naked and trembling on the cold stone floor was Ronan, his body covered in sweat and blood from minor wounds, his breath coming in ragged, exhausted gasps. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his eyes, his own dark, human eyes, finding hers. They were filled with shame, horror, and a profound, soul-shattering vulnerability. The secret was out. She had seen him at his absolute worst, in his most monstrous state. He was broken before her. "The curse," he rasped, his voice raw. "It's a flaw in our blood. It feeds on our power. The stronger the king, the more agonizing the transformation. It drives us mad with pain until we become that." He gestured weakly to the splintered door. "It's why I live in isolation. Why I can never have a mate. Who could bind themselves to that?" His confession hung in the air, a testament to a lifetime of lonely suffering. Ayla slowly pushed herself to a sitting position. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a moment before she gently brushed a stray lock of damp hair from his forehead. "I could," she whispered. His eyes widened, and in their depths, something broken began to mend. News of the broken door and the shattered silver lock could not be contained. Servants whispered in the kitchens, guards exchanged grim looks in the courtyards. And where whispers traveled, Lord Malachi was never far behind. He saw his opportunity not in the king's vulnerability, but in the chance to exploit it. Less than a week after the full moon, Malachi arrived at the fortress, and this time he was not alone. He was flanked by a contingent of old guard alphas from powerful traditionalist packs. They were stern, gray-muzzled wolves who believed strength was measured only in battle and that compassion was a flaw. They demanded an audience, and Ronan, now physically recovered but emotionally raw, granted it in the Great Hall. Ayla stood at his side, a silent act of solidarity that caused a murmur of disapproval among the assembled alphas. Ronan had insisted. "You are part of this," he had said. "We face them together." Malachi stepped forward, his expression one of grave, feigned concern. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice resonating with false piety. "We come before you not as challengers, but as loyal subjects concerned for the throne and the strength of our people. Word has spread of recent events, of a loss of control, of the influence of this Omega." He gestured toward Ayla as if she were a piece of filth. "She has a name. Ronan's voice was dangerously low, a rumbling threat. Malachi ignored him. The Packs are uneasy. They see their king, a king whose bloodline is already known to carry a difficult burden, shunning his counsel and spending his days with a wolfless girl. A barren Omega. It is a sign of weakness, Your Majesty, an infection in the heart of our kingdom. One of the older alphas spoke up, his voice a gravelly bark. The traditions are clear. A king must be strong, his mate must be a pure-blooded alpha, capable of bearing strong heirs. This arrangement is an abomination. It invites disaster. We propose a solution, Malachi continued smoothly, sensing he had the room's support. A purification ritual, to cleanse the spirit and reaffirm your strength. And you must renounce this Omega. Send her away. Banish her. Show the Packs that your focus is on your duty, not on a foolish infatuation. It was a perfectly laid trap. If Ronan agreed, he would lose Ayla and show himself to be weak, easily swayed by their pressure. If he refused, they would brand him a heretic, a king corrupted by a weak Omega, and use it as justification to challenge his rule openly. Ayla's blood ran cold. She could see the political checkmate for what it was. She looked at Ronan, willing to step away, to sacrifice herself for the sake of his crown if she had to. Ronan was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the hard, judgmental faces before him. He then turned his head and looked at Ayla. His expression was not one of conflict or doubt. It was calm, resolute, and filled with a warmth that made her breath catch. He had already made his choice. He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It was a public, possessive, and utterly defiant gesture. A collective gasp went through the hall. "There will be no ritual," Ronan said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He turned his burning gaze back to his uncle. "And I will not renounce her. You speak of strength, uncle. You speak of tradition. But your vision is narrow. You see strength only in the clenched fist, in the bared fang." He held up their joined hands. "You see this girl, and you call her weak. I see a strength you cannot comprehend. Her presence has brought me more clarity and peace than any of your empty rituals. Her courage in the face of my curse was greater than that of any warrior I have ever known. You call her wolfless. I call her my salvation." He took a step forward, pulling Ayla with him. They stood before the assembled alphas, united. "She is not an infection. She is the cure. She will not be banished. She will remain here, by my side, as my mate, as your future queen." The declaration was a thunderbolt that shattered the tension into stunned silence. Malachi's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. His plan had not just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. He had tried to force Ronan to choose between his duty and his heart, and Ronan had chosen both, redefining his duty to include her. "This is madness," the old alpha snarled. "You would place a barren Omega on the throne? Her worth is not measured by her womb." Ronan shot back, his power flaring, forcing the alphas to take an involuntary step back. "It is measured by her character. Something you and my uncle so clearly lack. Now get out of my hall, get out of my fortress, and carry my message back to your Packs." A new era has begun. Ronan's declaration of war, for that is what it was, echoed through the territories. Malachi and his allies retreated, but their silence was the simmering quiet of a brewing storm. They would not accept this. Ronan had thrown down the gauntlet, choosing a wolfless Omega over centuries of tradition. He had shown them her value, but they were blind to it, seeing only weakness and a path to power. A tense, watchful peace settled over the fortress. Ronan began to consolidate his power, sending Fen to meet with loyalist pacts, shoring up his alliances. He and Ayla were inseparable, a united front against the coming conflict. Their bond deepened with every passing day, the quiet moments in the library now filled with shared glances, soft touches, and the unspoken acknowledgement that they were all the other had. The fear of what was to come was eclipsed by the joy of having finally found a place to belong. Malachi's move came sooner than they expected. He called for a grand council, a gathering of alphas from every pack in the kingdom, to be held in the neutral territory of the Sunken Valley. The stated purpose was to discuss a growing threat from feral wolves on the southern border. The true purpose, as Ronan knew, was to put him on trial. It was a public stage, and Malachi intended to be the star of the show. "It's a trap," Fen said, pacing Ronan's study. "He will have assassins in the crowd. He will have plants among the alphas, ready to shout you down. He will turn it into a circus. And if I do not go, I am a coward who hides behind his fortress walls," Ronan countered, his jaw tight. "He has left me no choice. I must face him." "Then I will go with you," Isla said, her voice firm. She had been listening from the doorway. "They see me as your weakness. Let them see me by your side. Let them see that I am not afraid." Ronan turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and terror. "Ayla, it will be dangerous." "My life has been in danger since the moment I fell into your arms," she replied softly. "I would rather face it with you than hide from it here." And so it was decided. They would travel to the Grand Council together. The day of the council was overcast, the sky a bruised purple. The Sunken Valley was a natural amphitheater, and hundreds of wolves had gathered, their scents a chaotic mix of hostility, curiosity, and fear. As Ronan and Ayla entered, with Fen and a small contingent of royal guards, a wave of whispers followed them. Malachi stood on a raised dais, already addressing the crowd. He looked every bit the statesman, his voice filled with passion and false sincerity as he spoke of the feral wolf threat. But when he saw Ronan, his eyes glittered with triumph. He had his audience. The meeting began, a tedious affair of reports and posturing. Ronan remained silent, watching, waiting. Isla sat beside him, her back straight, her expression serene, refusing to show the fear that fluttered in her stomach. The trap was sprung during the midday meal. A servant, his face a blank mask, approached with a silver flagon and 2 goblets, offering a ceremonial drink to the king. It was a tradition of hospitality. To refuse would be a grave insult. Fen moved to intercept, to taste it first as was his duty, but Malachi called out, "Let the king drink. Let us toast to a swift victory over our enemies." The other alphas took up the cry, and Fen was trapped by protocol. Ronan took the goblet, his eyes locking with Malachi's over the rim. He knew. They both knew. He drank it down in one long swallow. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Ronan's hand went to his chest, his knuckles white. A low gasp escaped his lips. His eyes, when they met Ayla's, were wide with a sudden searing agony that was terrifyingly familiar. Poison. But it was not a poison meant to kill. It was something far worse. Ayla could feel it instantly. A volatile, cursed magic flooding his system, agitating the dormant beast within him. It was a catalyst, designed to trigger the monstrous transformation of the full moon, here and now, in the full light of day, in front of the entire leadership of the kingdom. Malachi's men, disguised as council guards, began to move, drawing their weapons. Their intent was clear. They would provoke the beast, then slay it, hailing Malachi as the hero who saved them from a cursed mad king. A guttural roar of pure agony ripped from Ronan's throat. He staggered, clutching his head as his body began to contort. The alphas nearest to him scrambled back in terror, their faces pale. The curse was taking hold with unnatural speed, fueled by the poison. Black, shadowy energy began to bleed from his skin, his form starting to twist and elongate. "The king is cursed! He loses control!" Malachi bellowed, pointing a dramatic, accusatory finger. "He is a danger to us all. Subdue him." His designated men surged forward, their silver-bladed swords glinting in the dim light. They were not moving to subdue. They were moving to kill. Fen and the loyal royal guards instantly formed a protective circle around Ronan, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The clash of steel rang out through the valley. Ayla's world narrowed to the man convulsing at her side. She could feel his losing battle, his spirit being overwhelmed by the poison-fueled torment. The red glow she remembered with such horror was beginning to kindle in his eyes. He was slipping away from her. Panic and clarity struck her in the same instant. Her touch, her presence, was a balm. It soothed the natural pain of the curse. But this was unnatural, a magical accelerant. She needed to do more than just be near him. She needed to be an anchor, a tether to his humanity so strong it could pull him back from the brink. Ignoring the chaos of the battle erupting around them, ignoring Fen's desperate shout for her to get back, Ayla threw herself at Ronan. She wrapped her arms around his neck from behind, pressing her cheek against his back as his body spasmed violently. "Ronan, fight it!" She screamed into his ear, her voice raw with desperation. "Don't let him win! Come back to me." She closed her eyes and focused, not on soothing, but on sharing. She opened the core of her being, the quiet, gentle place that was uniquely her, and poured it into him. She didn't try to fight the raging storm of the curse. She simply tried to exist within it, a tiny, unshakable point of calm. She shared her memories with him through their bond. The scent of flowers in the hidden garden, the warmth of the library fire, the feeling of his hand in hers. She poured all of her love, all of her hope, all of her unwavering belief in the man he was, directly into his fracturing soul. For a terrifying moment, it seemed to be useless. The shadowy energy intensified, lashing out and pushing her back. But she held on, her grip like iron, her will a silent roar that matched his own. Then, something shifted. Through their connection, she felt his consciousness, buried deep beneath the pain, latch onto hers. He found her in the hurricane. He anchored himself to her. The shadowy tendrils faltered. The violent convulsions lessened. The inhuman roar softened into a pained groan. Slowly, agonizingly, the transformation began to reverse. The black energy receded back into his skin, like smoke being inhaled. The red light in his eyes faded, replaced by his own familiar dark gaze, clouded with pain but blessedly sane. He collapsed backward, and she went down with him, cradling his head in her lap as he gasped for breath, the poison being fought back by his own immense strength, now that his mind was clear. The fighting stopped. Everyone, Malachi's men, the royal guards, the assembled alphas, stared in stunned silence. They had just witnessed the impossible. They had seen the monstrous curse rise, and they had seen a wolfless Omega girl quell it with nothing but an embrace. Malachi's face was a picture of disbelief and fury. His perfect plan lay in ruins at his feet. Ronan, propped up on one elbow, his breathing still ragged, lifted his head and pointed a trembling finger at his uncle. "Treason!" he rasped, his voice weak but carrying the weight of a king's judgment. "He poisoned me. Seize him." The spell of silence broke. The crowd, having seen the truth with their own eyes, turned on Malachi. The alphas who had been his allies now looked at him with contempt. They had been manipulated, their traditions used as a tool for a traitor's ambition. Malachi tried to flee, but he was quickly surrounded by a sea of angry alphas, his path to power ending here, in the dirt of the sunken valley. Ayla's useless gift had not only saved the man she loved, it had saved the entire kingdom from a tyrant. The aftermath of the Grand Council was swift and decisive. With Malachi's treason laid bare for all to see, his support crumbled into dust. He was imprisoned in the very fortress he had sought to rule, his followers disgraced and stripped of their titles. The kingdom, which had teetered on the brink of civil war, breathed a collective sigh of relief. Ronan, now free from the immediate threat of his uncle and with Ayla as his constant companion, found that the curse's hold on him had fundamentally weakened. The daily grinding pain was gone, replaced by a dull, manageable ache. The full moons were still a trial, but with Ayla by his side, her calming presence a powerful anchor, he no longer lost himself to the beast. He remained Ronan, enduring the pain without succumbing to the madness. He stood before the newly convened council, this time filled with loyal alphas and new, younger leaders who were not so beholden to the old ways. Ayla was at his side, no longer a figure of controversy, but one of reverence. The story of her courage in the sunken valley had spread like wildfire, transforming her from the wolfless Omega into the king's heart, the woman whose strength was of a different, more profound kind. Lord Malachi and his ilk believed our strength came only from our beasts, Ronan announced, his voice echoing in the great hall. They believed compassion was weakness, and that tradition must be followed blindly, even when it is cruel. They were wrong. True strength is not the ability to dominate, but the courage to protect. It is the wisdom to accept change and the resilience to heal. My mate, Ayla, has taught me this. He turned to her, taking her hands in his. The entire council watched, their expressions ones of respect and admiration. She will no longer be just my mate, he declared. She is my queen. And together, we will lead our people into a new era, an era where all strengths are valued and where the heart is as important as the claw. Days later, in the grand square before the fortress, a ceremony was held. It was not a traditional mating, which was often a private, pack-bound affair. Ronan wanted a public declaration, a coronation of sorts. He wanted everyone to witness the solidification of their bond. Ayla stood on the dais with him, dressed in simple white, a stark contrast to his dark royal leathers. She was not afraid. She met the eyes of the thousands of wolves gathered below, and she saw not scorn or pity, but hope. Her family was in the front row. Her father's face was a complex mixture of regret and awe. Lena was weeping openly, tears of pure, unadulterated joy for her sister. Ronan turned to her, his eyes soft. I was a king of a lonely, pain-filled kingdom of one, he murmured for her alone to hear. You gave me a world. He leaned in and, following the ancient rite, gently bit the juncture of her neck and shoulder. It was not a violent act of possession, but a tender, permanent promise. A spark of brilliant, warm energy flooded her senses, and for the first time she felt the thrum of a true mating bond snap into place. It was a connection that ran soul deep, a channel through which she could feel his love, his devotion, his relief. And through it, she felt something else stir deep within her, a dormant, sleeping presence, awakened by the bond, her wolf. 1 year later, Queen Ayla stood on the balcony of the royal wing, Ronan's arms wrapped securely around her from behind. The fortress that had once been her prison was now her home, and it was no longer a place of cold silence. It was filled with the sounds of a bustling, prosperous court. The kingdom was at peace. Ronan's rule, tempered by Ayla's compassion, had ushered in an age of unprecedented stability. The old, brutal traditions were fading, replaced by a culture that valued empathy and community. The packs were thriving. Ayla rested a hand on her swollen belly, a gentle smile gracing her lips. The child within, their heir, was a symbol of the new era, a product of a love that had defied every convention. The lie that she was barren had been broken, just as the king's curse had been. "She's restless today," Ayla murmured, feeling a soft kick. "She has her mother's spirit," Ronan rumbled, pressing a kiss to her temple. He was a changed man. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, abiding contentment. He was still the powerful Alpha King, but he was no longer a slave to his pain. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the vast forest, Ayla felt that familiar, gentle stirring within her. Closing her eyes, she reached for it, not with fear or desperation, but with peaceful acceptance. Ronan felt the shift through their bond and tightened his embrace, his chin resting on her shoulder as he watched. A soft, silvery light enveloped Ayla. When it faded, standing where she had been, was a wolf. It was not a massive beast of war like Ronan's great black wolf, but a sleek, graceful creature with a coat the color of moonlight and eyes that held all of Ayla's wisdom and compassion. Her wolf had come not with a scream of rage or a roar of dominance, but with a quiet sigh of belonging. It was a guardian, a healer, a queen. She turned her head and met the gaze of Ronan's own wolf, which looked out at her from his eyes. There, on the balcony, as dusk settled over their peaceful kingdom, the king and his queen, the black wolf and the silver, stood together, whole, healed, and finally home.